Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Roggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. And this is Generation Jihad, the podcast that documents and discusses what used to be known as the global war on terror, or what we call the Long War. It's a vast battlefield that spans continents. Today's episode, I have my friend and colleague, Joe Truzman. Joe is a research analyst at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, as well as a contributor to FDD's Long War Journal, where he focuses on Israel, Palestinian terrorist groups, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, a whole range of topics. Joe, welcome to Generation Jihad.
Thank you for having me, Bill. It's quite a pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's long overdue, Joe. The Afghanistan and other issues really sucked up a lot of our time and energy, and we've been wanting to get you on for quite some time. But I think the recent situation in Israel with a slate of attacks and your excellent coverage of that is certainly was a great opportunity for us to get you on the program.
Great, I appreciate it. Thank you.
No, you're welcome. Joe, so there's been high-profile attacks in Israel since March 22nd. Tell us a little bit about each attack and explain who was involved and what Israel's reaction has been.
Right. So first, I'd preface is that just Israel is new. Terror isn't new to Israel, unfortunately. These terror attacks, I wouldn't say they're routine, but unfortunately, it happens.
It's part of the fabric of Israeli society for decades, right?
Exactly. And these type of terror attacks we see as they happen a lot in hot spots, like the West Bank, Israeli settlements in the West Bank, sometimes in Jerusalem's old city as well. However, these attacks are different just because they occur deep inside Israel. And just for instance, the first one that happened March 22nd in Sheba, which is the city in southern Israel, committed by actually an Israeli citizen, Israeli Bedouin, Mohammed Abu al-Karim. His method of attack, he used his vehicle and a knife. He ran over a cyclist. Then he drove to a gas station and stabbed someone there, then moved on to a mall where he attacked other civilians. Eventually, he was killed by an armed civilian. I believe it was a bus driver. A little bit about the attacker. Israeli media reported he had some links to ISIS. He was imprisoned in 2016 for membership in a terror organization. He was charged with disseminating extremist teachings, and he also was charged with attempting to join ISIS in Syria. However, even though he had links to ISIS, the Israeli security authorities, or the Israeli authorities, believed he acted alone. So they claimed him they said he was a lone wolf. So, and I looked a little bit into him as well, and couldn't see any direction or that he wasn't directed by ISIS. Doesn't seem, and even though then there wasn't really a straight claim from ISIS that he was one of their members. They did mention him later on in one of their newsletters and one of their statements, but they weren't clear. They never said he was a member of ISIS. So that was the March 22nd attack.
And before we go forward there, Joe, like the Islamic State, would claim credit for if he was one of them, if they had recruited him and had him in the fold, we would know about that. In the past, the Islamic State has issued videos or shared other type of information on connections. So this is more of what we would what I don't like the term, but it's what's commonly referred to as an inspired attack. And it's not something that's just, Al-Qaeda actually pioneered this, and their magazine, which used to be run by Anwar al-Awlaki, a radical cleric. The Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had a magazine called Inspire that would encourage Muslims to carry out attacks like this if they weren't able to reach the battlefield or get support. So I think this very likely, as you noted, is it an inspired type attack. And I'm going to share one other quick thing here. Sorry to jump in. I several years ago I was in Israel and I had an opportunity to do training. To do a simulation for Israeli security forces and how they would react to terror attacks like you described, a stabbing attack, ramming attack or a vehicle attack, things of that nature. But the troops that were trained for this were really troops that were either in Palestinian territories or checkpoints, things of that nature on the edge. And I think what makes this attack so significant, as you noted, it's inside Israel. This was a vulnerability that very likely exists. Israeli troops, I think, are very well trained to handle those types of situations on the peripheries, but I'm wondering how prepared they are for this to happen inside their own cities.
Right. And I think that's what has got the Israeli public a little bit nervous, I guess you could say. I mean, this was just the first high profile attack. Nobody knew what was coming after. And that leads me to the second attack, which was on March 27th in a town called Hadera, north of Tel Aviv. So two Israeli citizens, actually this time there was two of them. They were Arabs, Arab Israelis. They were cousins, Ayman and Khalid Iqbariya. They were from a town called al-Faham, and they launched a shooting attack and they killed two police officers. The difference here is that compared to the first attack on March 22nd was that they actually uploaded a video to Facebook on one of the shooters' accounts, and they pledged allegiance to the Islamic State and its caliph. That was published right before the attack. And then after the attack, some hours later, ISIS claimed, they published a statement claiming responsibility for the attack. A mock news agency. A little bit about the attackers. Israeli reports said at least one of them tried to join ISIS in 2016, but he ended up getting arrested by Turkish police. I'm assuming there was a little bit of intelligence given to the Turkish police by the Israelis. In this one, I don't believe these attackers, at least I haven't seen evidence that these attackers were directed by ISIS. They were almost inspired, even though they did pledge allegiance to the Islamic State before the attack. But I still didn't see any evidence that ISIS directed them. But of course, ISIS being ISIS, they claimed responsibility because it was attacking in Israel. And in the statement that ISIS published, they mentioned the first attacker on the 22nd. But like I said, they never claimed him, said he was a member. So that was the second attack on March 27th.
So in the second attack, is there any indication where the two attackers were able to obtain their weapons?
No, I haven't seen anything where they were able to get their weapons. Unfortunately, there's a lot of weapons trafficking in Israel. That's something they've been dealing with for a long time. I've seen a lot of reports where actually IDF bases get raided, and a lot of ammunition is stolen, weapons are stolen, even night vision goggles are stolen, and it's been a problem for several years now, and I haven't seen anything lately, so they may have it under control, but there's definitely a problem with the weapons trafficking, and not only just inside Israel, and we can get to this a little bit later, but also Hezbollah and the Iranians have tried to smuggle weapons into Israel to arm Palestinian factions. On the 29th, just a couple days later, in Bnei Barak, a high-profile attack was right outside Tel Aviv. This one actually was perpetrated by a Palestinian, Dia Hamarsha, and he was able to exploit I guess you could say, a hole through the security barrier in the West Bank. I believe he stole a car, and he was armed with a semi-automatic rifle. He went to Hadera and was able to start shooting civilians. He ended up killing 5 people, 4 of them civilians. 2 were actually foreign nationals. I believe they were Ukrainian, and 1 was a police officer. He ended up being killed by Israeli security forces. Unfortunately, he was able to kill 5 people. Again, with this one, there's no information about the Islamic State or if he had been directed by the Islamic State. Actually, there wasn't any information about if he was directed by any militant organization. Israeli reports stated that he was arrested several years ago for trying to buy explosives, to try to join a terrorist organization. But again, like the others, he was released, and unfortunately was able to commit this attack several years later. The fourth attack occurred last night in Tel Aviv, in a busy street called Dizengoff Street. It's a very popular area, very popular street with a lot of shops. The attacker, now identified as Ra'ad Hazem from the West Bank town of Jenin. Last night's attack has left 3 civilians dead and approximately 10 others injured. After the attack, he was actually able to escape. Unlike the other attacks, he was on the run for approximately 9 hours. He was eventually found in Jaffa at a mosque, where he was shot and killed by counterterrorism forces. Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade published a message, or rather a video this morning. Its self-described military spokesperson, Abu Muhammad, just stated the operation was the beginning of a campaign called Eye of the Hurricane. And in his video, or in his address, he claimed that last night's shooter was one of their militants.
And really quick, Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, who's that associated with?
Fatah. Yeah, they couldn't do with Fatah. Yeah. And yeah, there's quite a few Palestinian militant organization. At least in the West Bank, it's a little easier as far as the numbers, as far as which groups are prevalent there. It's Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and of course Hamas. Those are the 3 main groups in the West Bank. I also strongly caution that militant groups, at least with Palestinian militant groups, they tend to claim attacks even though they had nothing to do with it. So it's I strongly caution it with this claim, just due to the fact that they haven't, at least in the video that was published by Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, they have not shown any evidence that he was a militant of theirs. This is just a statement or a claim. So I strongly caution that just because they're saying he was a part of their group or their organization doesn't mean that he is. They may just try to be boosting their image, like in previous attacks.
Obviously, quite a bit of instability caused by these attacks throughout Israel. What has the Israeli security services response been to this recent spate of terrorism in, like you said, in the heartland of Israel?
Right. So they've definitely stepped up raids, especially in the towns where the perpetrators, these attackers, were from. Of course, they've arrested associates and people who they believe were involved in the attacks. Of course, what they're trying to do here is stop another attack from happening. Unfortunately, what we see here a lot, at least in the past, is that if there's a successful attack, it can spawn copycat attacks, and I think that's what's happening here. The first attack was successful in Sheba, the March 22nd attack, and so spawned copycat attacks, and that's, I think, what the Israelis are dealing with right now. Something I think is also important that I should mention is that I've tracked FDD's Long War Journal since last year. The uptick in militant activity in the West Bank. There have been a considerable amount of Israeli raids, Israeli security forces raiding or operations rather against militant groups in the West Bank. Actually, quite a number of militants have been killed in the West Bank since beginning of last year due to Israeli operations, much more than previous years. And I feel that what I've observed is that these militant organizations, specifically Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, have almost like reorganized and to counter these Israeli raids. And what I've talked about, what I published previously on FD's Long War Journal, is I believe it was last month or a couple of months ago, was an establishment of a new joint operations room, and where these two militant groups have organized and are, I guess you could say, responding to the Israeli, specifically IDF presence in the West Bank, conducting shooting attacks, and if there are any attempts by the Israeli security services or the IDF to arrest militants in the West Bank, which is a common occurrence, we see a lot of shootings occur or fighting back against during the raid. So we've seen a lot of that, and it's been thoroughly documented in my previous reports on FDD's Long War Journal. Something else I'd also like to note, and I think is important. I've talked to some Israelis rather, in living in Israel, just to see, how things have changed since these attacks. And I've been told that the security, the presence, especially the police presence, is very noticeable. I had one person tell me that she would notice the Israeli bicycle or motorcycle officers following the buses or other public transportation, which they didn't before. So you could definitely see there is, you see the, at least the police presence, the increased police presence due to these attacks. And yeah, it's obviously it's affecting daily life in Israel, but of course, you got to keep going.
Yeah, and as anyone who's been into Israel knows, it's a security in Israel is quite more noticeable than it is here in the United States or in other Western countries, and that's before attacks like this have kicked off. So it must be something that's impacting the Israelis. One quick note here as well. You had described the copycat type attacks. I also think there's an element here of what I call a use it or lose it. When an attack like this happens, others who are planning attacks like this recognize there may be stepped up raids against, anyone suspected of being involved. So they may be, deciding to carry out these attacks before they can be rounded up as well. We don't know. I mean, I'm just but that's an observation I've seen, in other theaters where a senior person who might know about someone, or when, someone's captured or there's a certain type of incident, you can often see a little flurry of activity like this. So I think it really just remains to be seen whether this will be continued, or will the Israeli security forces are able to, tamp down this problem. So, Joe, what's the Palestinian terror groups? What is their reaction to these recent attacks, on this? And how does this modify or change their strategy, or does their strategy change at all?
Right. So, like I mentioned before, there's no real indication that, at least that they're involved in the attacks, that they're directed at the attacks. Yes, there was a statement, like I said earlier, about Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades claiming that the attack, the last attack, but I don't. Like I said, I don't think that was genuine. However, like Hezbollah, the Hamas does pay a lot of attention to the mood here. So the strategy has been for Hamas is to involve themselves in with the Israelis and the Arabs, their disputes. So what's happening here now in the last 3 days? Not only for Hamas, this is other Palestinian factions. They are they're inciting violence. They see an opportunity here. That's the point. If they see an opportunity, they try to take it. And what we've seen statements and calls to incite for more violence. For instance, I'll give you another example here. Several days ago, last week actually, Palestinian Islamic Jihad's Secretary General, who lives abroad, I believe he lives in Lebanon, called for more attacks. He made a public statement calling for more attacks. And also, there was a statement made by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad's so-called military wing. So it's called Saraya al-Quds, saying that the military, their militants were mobilized. They were ready. Basically, they were saying they were ready to attack if given the signal. So they issue these statements to almost cause further unrest. They know the Israeli public's nervous. They know the Israeli authorities are doing everything they can to stop these attacks. And by publishing these statements, they are also attempting to incite further violence or inspire, like, even though we don't like that word, but inspire further attacks or more lone wolf attacks. Hamas, like I said, they try to boost their image with these statements, or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or any other group, locally and regionally. They try to boost their image. Like I said, they call for more attacks, and now during Ramadan, especially, they're taking advantage, and they're trying to create this atmosphere conducive to more violence, and they prefer to keep the fight in Israel. It's easier for them. I mean, we got to remember, almost a year ago, there was a pretty big conflict, an 11-day conflict in Gaza, and I'm starting to see a little of the same signals and signs that led to that conflict with these attacks. And that's what I think the Israeli security services are very worried about.
Yeah, that gets to before I get to your next question, what you described there, the latching onto the cause, so to speak, is very common in the jihadist world. We see the Al-Qaeda, or the Islamic, particularly Al-Qaeda, does this quite a bit, where they attach themselves to a cause. A Quran is desecrated in Afghanistan, and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban make this an issue of theirs, right? It's part of the messaging of how the West is trying to destroy Islam or disrespect Islam. And I think you're describing it very nicely, how Palestinian terror groups are able to, it's wise, right? It's a wise thing to do from a propaganda standpoint. Latch yourself onto a cause that will help increase your profile and make it look like you're the defenders of the aggrieved party. Joe, you did a great job detailing the current situation, as the situation as it stands inside of Israel. Looking ahead, prognosticating here, I know it's always a difficult thing to do. But what do you expect to happen here? Do you think there's more attacks? Do you think that's down the road? Do you think Israeli security services will be able to tamp this down? What do you think is going to happen here?
Right. Yeah, it's a difficult question and difficult to forecast. The Israeli government, certainly expects, I believe, more attacks to occur. Last week, the Prime Minister Bennett called on civilians who have weapons permits to carry and be vigilant. Continues, and now, especially over the last few days, after the start of Ramadan, there have been continued clash. There have been clashes at the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem between the Israeli police and Palestinians, and these images of clashes that you see, especially through Palestinian social media and social networks, only adds more to the fire and the instability. And this is what actually Hamas wants. This is what they thrive on. They love this stuff because they can jump on it and say, hey, we're here, we're helping out the Palestinian people who are being what they see or what they view as being abused by the Israelis. And unfortunately, this is a difficult situation, especially for the Israeli police in this instance, to try not to be heavy-handed. I'm not saying that they are, but all their moves are being recorded, they're being watched, and they will be used in any type of violence has occurred or will occur. And especially what we've seen in the last couple of days over Ramadan at the Damascus Gate will be used as a way for Hamas to jump in, which they actually really haven't as of yet. Yes, they've called for violence. They've tried to incite more attacks, but I haven't really seen. We haven't seen any Hamas militants carrying out attacks. There's known Hamas militants. PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, on the other hand, has been involved a little more than Hamas. Maybe they're taking the lead. I'm not sure here, but for the moment, it's still a difficult situation. We haven't had any major attacks or high-profile attacks since the last one, but it's. I believe Palestinian groups are trying, and they're taking advantage. Actually, it's noteworthy to mention there was a counterterrorism raid against three Palestinian Islamic Jihad members who, according to Israeli media reports, were on their way to carry out an attack. The Israeli counterterrorism forces were killed the three PIJ Palestinian Islamic Jihad members in the raid. So we're seeing that militant groups are trying to take advantage of the attacks or the atmosphere that the terrorism or the wave of terrorism that's happening right now. So I expect more attacks to happen. Eventually, I think the Israeli authorities will be able to clamp down on this and keep the level down compared to what it is now. But it's definitely a difficult task. And Ramadan, Passover, and Easter all coinciding over the next few weeks is going to make that very difficult.
You had mentioned, you had briefly discussed the 11-day war. Do you think, you had said there's some indications that we're seeing of the precursors to that. Do you think that this is it likely, a possibility? How would you rate it on a scale of 1 to 10? Do you think that this can lead to that type of conflict where the Israelis and the Palestinians are in a state of open war? Or do you think this is something that probably could be tamped down?
Right. I'm seeing it's not the terror attacks, the wave of terrorism that has me so much worried that Gaza and Israel are going to go into conflict again like they did last year. It's the clashes at Damascus Gate and possibly, and hopefully not, though, that it could spill over, especially into Al-Aqsa Mosque. And why I'm saying that, because last year, Hamas used the clashes at Damascus Gate and at Al-Aqsa Mosque between Palestinians and Israel as an excuse, as I see it, as an excuse to launch an attack against Israel. What they said was that they were defending the rights of the Palestinian people. Therefore, since they wanted to be viewed as the defenders of the Palestinian people, so they started launching rockets at Jerusalem. That was their first attack. I'm starting to see the same images of Israeli police and Palestinians clashing the last couple of days that I did last year. It's very similar. And my concern there, like I said before, is that it'll continue, and then it'll give Hamas what they need to launch an attack. But the thing here is, last year's conflict, Israel degraded Hamas's capabilities, military capabilities, significantly. Whether they want to inflict or start another attack, start another conflict, I don't know. However, there's a little bit of signaling from the groups with statements that it's building up. You start seeing threats about Jews praying at Al-Aqsa Mosque, which they have threatened before, but the rhetoric is more violent. I feel it's a little different than the usual statements that we see, and I'm just seeing, like I said, the same images and fighting that was one of the causes that led up to last year's conflict. So I'm hoping the Israeli police notice this and understand that this can definitely start another conflict if they aren't careful.
Yeah, so you're seeing the precursors, the messaging, things, that type of, those are the warning signs, not necessarily in any type of military activity, so to speak.
Right. There hasn't been another thing I think that's noteworthy is last year there was statements made by Hamas's, you can call him, but they referred to him as the military wings commander, Mohammed Deif. He hadn't spoken or he hadn't published statements in years. And last year he started publishing statements threatening Israel that something would happen, that there would be a conflict if clashes continued. We have not seen that yet. I think that's important to note. What we've mostly seen is just actually from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, like I mentioned earlier, about mobilizing their fighters. But there has not been explicit publications or statements saying there will be rockets, for example, from Gaza. There won't be rockets launched from Gaza. We haven't seen that yet. However, I'm seeing the build up to that. And that's where my concern is.
And is there a Hezbollah or Iran connection to this wave of violence, or to this sort of this messaging campaign that you're starting to detect? What's the, obviously both Hezbollah and Iran will profit from any type of discord between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and they'll capitalize on this. So do you see any evidence that they're stoking the fire here, or are they just sitting on the sidelines?
Right. For now, I only see statements, only from Hezbollah at least, inciting violence and congratulating the attackers. But the interesting thing is that I didn't mention, at least with the second attack, with the one that involved the members of ISIS, or the ones that pledged allegiance to ISIS, all the Palestinian factions, including Hezbollah, congratulated the attackers and the attack while knowing that they were members of ISIS, which is very strange because you don't see that. We know Hezbollah, what they were doing in Syria, they were fighting ISIS. So it just seemed very strange to me that Hezbollah and many of the Palestinian factions, not just a couple, almost a dozen of them, published congratulatory messages after the ISIS attack. It was a little strange, and I was a little surprised I didn't see more about that in the media, where Palestinian organizations and Hezbollah were congratulating ISIS for the attack.
Not even in the Israeli media?
There was, there was a little bit, but it was just not. It was. They didn't really take advantage of the messaging. Why they didn't really explore why is Hezbollah and these other Palestinian groups rather congratulating ISIS for their attack. It doesn't, even though they were careful, the statements were carefully worded. They didn't mention we congratulate ISIS for the attack, but they knew they were members of ISIS. So why are they congratulating the attack? And that's because, at least what it seems, is that ISIS and Hezbollah and Palestinian militant organizations have at least something in common, and that's killing Israelis, and that's what I got from it. I think the last attack, March 29th attack, Palestinian militant organizations were a little more cautious. I felt that they were a little more cautious before publishing statements. I feel that they waited a little longer than the previous attacks to publish statements congratulating the attacks. Maybe they realized they had made a mistake there. But I still think it was very interesting to see these organizations, especially Hezbollah, congratulating the attacks, even though they knew it was perpetrated by ISIS.
Thank you, Joe. And Joe, one last question before you leave. We're going to switch gears just a little bit. Late last May, you broke the news that an American was killed while fighting fighting for Hamas. That was a very nice scoop by you, by the way. I remember working you through that one. Tell us just a little bit quick about that story, a little bit about the background and what that all meant. I just, just a little aside, after Joe published that shortly, I think it was like ABC News tried to take credit for it. And, we fought in the background and made sure Joe got appropriate credit. That happens to us. Sometimes you don't see the things that go on behind the scenes. I mean, we're always careful to cite our sources, and we expect the same from others. And, so it was a really nice win for you, Joe. And, just want to share a little bit about that story. That one still sticks in my mind almost a year later.
Right. Yeah, it was a little, it was interesting because he was an American citizen. Basically, what happened? An American citizen was living in Gaza, and his father he was living there with his father. They were actually both engineers working for Hamas's self-described military wing, Al Qassam brigades. And during the conflict, they were targeted and by the IDF rather, and they were killed. A few days later, I believe it was like a day or two later, the family was mentioning that, talking about the dead, the father and the son that had died, and there was some indication there that they were either both of them were American or one of them was an American. So I looked further into it and was able to get solid information that the son was an American fighting for Hamas, and we published it on Long War Journal, and it was great. And as far as the information that we published there, and it's I can't recall, at least right now, of any other Hamas members that were American citizens, at least, that have been killed during in conflict with Israel. So it was a very, very interesting story, and yeah, so it did pretty well, I think.
You worked hard chasing that thing down. I mean, I think we spent, how many days was it before we actually published it?
Yeah,
published on that. It was a really boy. I just remember having those. So May 31st, right? Afghanistan has literally exploded. The Taliban's taking over districts. This was at the heat of it. And I'm working 20 something hour days at this point. And I get a phone call from Joe. Bill, you were so apologetic. And I'm like, Joe, I'm doing my job. My job is here to help you. And, we remember just talking. It's funny now that I think back on it, Joe. It was a nice little distraction from the madness that was Afghanistan that consumed my spring, summer, and fall of last year. And, and it was just so nice to see you work hard to get that to the bottom of that story, to confirm the work with all your sources on, both sides of the Atlantic to try to make that happen. And, we don't get tons of scoops at the Long War Journal, probably more before, when it was things like drone strikes in Pakistan or Yemen. And less so these days when with the U.S. a little bit, more disengaged from these wars. So it was a really nice thing to see. And I'm very, very proud of that reporting from you, Joe. I just, thank you for that.
Oh, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, it was an intense few days. You want to make sure you have the right information, and something like this, it's a pretty big deal. I mean, it's a U.S. American citizen. It's an American citizen rather,
fighting for a foreign terrorist organization.
Exactly.
You want to make sure you dot your I's and cross your T's on that one. And you did.
Exactly. So you want to just double check with your sources, and that's what I did. And, thankfully, we were able to get that out first, and we had everything verified, and it worked out. It was definitely one of my proudest moments as far as working with Long War Journal. So I'm very so happy about it. I have the article on the wall in my office. So I look at it almost every day and just happy about it.
Yeah, it's tough in this business to call it a business, whatever, this field to do things like that. And you are proud of your work. I could think back on multiple instances. And the weird thing is you almost want to get a shower after it's all done, right? You're dealing with terrorists and you got to scoop. But I always liken our work to sort of being like a homicide detective. You're investigating, you're getting to the bottom of things, motivations, who did what, and you're dealing with dirty, disgusting, horrific people who are often monsters. But you do get some kind of bizarre satisfaction in when you get it right and when you get the bottom of something. So I don't know if that's the best analogy, but it's the one that works in my head when people ask me, what do you do? And what is it like? It's the best way I could describe
it. Right. No, I completely agree. Especially the war last year, there was a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of civilian deaths, at least on both sides, of course. And it's tough. You see a lot of those images of war and death. It's yeah. Sometimes it takes a lot of out of you, and it's something I've had to learn to deal with, especially over the last few years working at Longwood Journal and FDD. So it's been. It's a pleasure because I think it's really important to get this type of information out, especially to a Western audience. And that's why I got into all of this. I saw that there was like a disconnect of good information, detailed information that I didn't see in the news that should get to a Western audience, especially at least with me, with the Palestinian conflict, Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So that motivated me to get into this type of business and learn about the groups, all the militant groups, and how it worked, how they worked, and their organizations. So yeah, it's been a pleasure so far. But it's at the points it is difficult.
It's been great working with you, Joe. And Joe, you just literally just described why I got into this almost 2 decades ago, right? Just looking at the reporting and seeing the holes and the misanalysis and the gaps, the lack of understanding of groups and their motivations. It's the same. You perfectly and succinctly described why I got into this business. And, it's been great working with you, and I look forward to working with you for years to come. Joe, thank you for joining us on Generation Jihad, and everyone, you could read Joe's work at Long War Journal, just longwarjournal.org. And Joe, we'll have you back on the podcast soon.
I appreciate it, Bill. Thank you for having me.
Oh, no, Joe, pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you could find us on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review, preferably a positive one. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again soon.